Shalom. The events around us lately hasn't been very encouraging, and perhaps some of us are still very nervous, anxious, and fearful. I'm talking about not only just the pandemic, but also rumors of war, floods, fires, earthquakes. If you remember, just a few months ago, the fires were raging in Australia, in New South Wales, and Victoria. Millions of acres were burnt and lost, and many people were suffering. Animals perished. Whole swath of vegetation were destroyed within just a couple of weeks. There are fires in Australia, and there are also floods, not only just in Jakarta early this year, but even as I record this sermon, we do know that China and Japan are facing one of the worst floodings they ever had in their history. In China alone, hundreds have lost their lives. And the Yangtze River and the Three Gorges Dam face the danger of a collapse. In the midst of all these calamities, all these pandemics, and even rumors of war, how should you and I as Christians respond during this time of great fear and uncertainty? Many of us could turn to the experts. We could turn to those people who perhaps could tell us what to do and how to live our lives, how to get our economy right. This crisis is not only just in the natural world. We are also facing economic crisis as well. Major economies like the US are going downhill. Even in our own country, Singapore, the economy has plunged, and we are technically in recession because of 2 quarters of downturns. And will this continue on? We do not know. Will this pandemic create further problems for you and I? That I will not know. You and I could never predict what will happen tomorrow. Never would I have imagined that we will be now in this situation and even facing uncertainties about tomorrow. In the midst of these uncertainties, in the midst of all these crises, and in the midst of the world that's going upside down, how should you and I respond? What could we do as followers of Jesus Christ? How could you and I face a world that may not have a tomorrow? These similar struggles and questions were asked some 3,000 years ago by the people of God in Israel. They were also going through tremendous uncertainty. The book of Psalms is written over a period of time and collected, I believe, during the return from the exile, from the Babylonian exile. And the people of God needed encouragement. And so, as a way to remind them of God's faithfulness and God's goodness and God's laws and the miracles that He has done in the past and will continue to do in the present and the future, the people of God look to this collection of 150 songs. And as they travel towards Jerusalem once a year, as they rebuild this temple, they remember who this God is. When they returned to the promised land, they had to rebuild the temple. And we read from the book of Ezra and Nehemiah that they don't just face problems from without. That means there were aliens living in that land, but they also had internal strife and conflicts amongst the people of God. And so, as they meditated on the goodness of God, as they think about and recall the stories of God's deliverance, one of the Psalms reminded them that God is in the midst of them, that God is their strength and ever-present help. And with that, you might turn with me to Psalm 46. In the midst of a pandemic and in the midst of chaos, how should you and I respond as believers in Jesus Christ, as followers of Jesus Christ? The psalmist reminds us in Psalm 46 that God is in control. Let me read for you verse 1. It says here, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore, we will not fear. The psalm begins with the title, To the Chief Priests of the Sons of Korah on Alamoth, a song. There's very little indication from this title of the historical context of this psalm. Some would have speculated that this was the deliverance given during the reign of Jehoshaphat in 2 Chronicles chapter 20. Others have suggested that it was written when the Assyrian army under Sennacherib was destroyed by God's angel and was forced to withdraw from Jerusalem in Isaiah 36 and 37. All these seems logical, but we cannot be certain. But what we can be certain of is that this psalm is a song of confidence and of trust in a God who never fails. Psalm 46 also has an interest in the stability of Zion or Jerusalem. In the present context, given the Jerusalem was spared from the wrath of Assyria, this psalm may have been produced to provide a joyful response to the escape of Jerusalem and Hezekiah from the Assyrians. Regardless of the historical context of this psalm, we know that this psalm reminds the people of God to place their trust in God in times of crisis. This psalm, Psalm 46, has links to some other psalms within a series of psalms, a family of psalms. We need to read this group of psalms in the light of the fact that they are in exile and coming back of exile. And in the midst of the persecution and the problems that they have from without and from within, the people of God are again reminded that God is in control. Psalm 46 is neatly divided into 3 different parts of about 4 verses each. There are 3 strophes or 3 passages or paragraphs, and each of them ends off with the word Selah. This psalm paints for us 3 different scenarios, and within each scenario, there's a call for the people of God to respond in the midst of these scenarios, in the midst of this crisis. And each response is centered on a particular attribute of God. So the first scene that we see is taken from Psalm 46 verses 1 to 3. Let me read for you verses 1 to 3. It says here, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore, we will not fear. Though the earth gives way, though the mountains be moved into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains tremble at its swelling. Selah. Here is a picture of natural disasters and calamities. We read various things that has happened in this scene. We can see that there are earthquakes, there are volcano eruptions, and of course, there's even tsunami when the mountains slip into the heart of the sea. When huge mountains are displaced and when that land falls right into the sea itself, what will happen? Well, I don't need to be a geologist or even a physicist to tell you that there will be water displacement, and that water pushes forward and can cause huge waves. Now, many of us in Singapore have never experienced earthquakes, volcano eruptions, or even tsunamis. We're well protected and we thank God for that protection. I've lived in countries before, for example, in Indonesia, where I face earthquakes and volcano eruptions almost on a yearly basis. I remember back in 2004, when the Indian Ocean tsunami hit Aceh, over 250,000 people perished. in Aceh alone. After the tsunami, I went and helped these people. I went to an island that's off the coast of Aceh that's called Nias, and I was doing some crisis relief work there to help the people there. And I can see the devastation and the death and the diseases that were there. It was horrifying. And I still remember also living in an apartment in Jakarta. And then there was an earthquake, a 6.4 earthquake, not a huge earthquake. But nevertheless, it shook the apartment. I was on the 15th floor. There was a 45-degree line crack on the wall of my living room. And I could even see through the crack to the lift landing. Thankfully, I wasn't there, but my wife was there. Wendy was there. And she panicked, and everyone panicked. And the whole building was really unsafe to live in. In the midst of all these earthquakes, all these natural disasters, and volcano eruptions, how should the people of God respond? How should you and I behave during this time? Notice that there are a series of repetitions here. The word though is repeated 4 times in just these 3 verses. Let me read for you those words. It says here, though the earth should change, though the mountains slip into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains quake. These are natural calamities, and it will definitely create fear in the people experiencing these natural calamities. As you see the volcano erupting and huge boulders flying up into the air as high as a kilometer up into the atmosphere. And these boulders are as big as a car, and it lands near you. How would you respond? What will be going through your mind? As you see huge walls of water crashing at 500 kilometers towards you, how would you respond? As you see the earth shake and the chandeliers move, and as your cupboards and your books topple over, and you couldn't even stand firm, how would you respond? If I were there and I've experienced all these things, I will be very fearful. I will be panicking. I will be so scared. And this is a natural response, because when we are fearful, we will tend to either freeze, or we will fight, or we will take flight. And chances are, if there is an earthquake, I will be the first to run out of the house because it's unsafe. I'll be running out of my apartment. But yet, we read that the psalmist calls the people of God in verse 2, and he says, therefore, we will not fear. How could that be? When you face all these natural calamities, these disasters, how could it be that we will not be fearful? How could it be that we will not tremble? And yet the psalmist reminds the people of God not to be fearful. Therefore, we will not fear. And he gives the reason why, and is centered on who God is, an attribute of God, and is found in verse 1. And he reminds the people of God, just as he's reminding you and I here today, that God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Because God is the source of the security and stability. As you see the walls of water coming crashing down, as the ground that you stand begins to shake and you cannot even stand, as you begin to fear and as you are panicking, the psalmist reminds us, we will not fear, because God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in times of trouble. That means God is accessible. God is immediately there for us. God is available to deliver us. I do not know what the psalmist had in mind when he tells them that God is a refuge and strength, a very present help. But I'm pretty sure that he must be thinking of the fact that God has delivered them in the past, and God will continue to deliver them in the present and the future. He's not some God that is made out of an image by your hands. He's not some God that is made up of stones or precious metal. He's a living and present God. He's alive. He's present. And He's powerful. And may I even add, even though this is not suggested here in the psalm, that this is the God of even nature. Obviously, when the psalmist reminds the people of God that God is a very present help in times of trouble, and he starts to name the series of natural disasters that will happen to the people of God in Israel, in this promised land, that he reminds them that this is also the God who created all these mountains and seas and the land, because He is the God of creation. And He has absolute control over His creation, which is why the people of God do not need to fear, which is why you and I today don't need to fear, because God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in times of trouble. Selah. Now the scene changes, and it changes to Jerusalem, to Zion. And this is found in verses 4 to 7. Let me read for you verses 4 to 7. It says here, "There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy habitation of the Most High. God is in the midst of her. She shall not be moved. God will help her when morning dawns. The nations rage, the kingdoms totter. He utters His voice, the earth melts. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is a fortress." Selah. From natural disasters and from calamities, from earthquakes, from volcano eruptions, from tsunamis, now the scene changes to a scene of the city of God, Zion. And the psalmist paints for us another picture, another scene. And this is a scene of nations gathering together to fight against the people of God. And these people are probably, the people of God are right now in the city of God, Jerusalem. And there we read in verse 6 that there are nations raging and kingdoms totter. This is a scene of a siege. The nations around Israel are gathered together. Perhaps they're thinking of Egypt, perhaps they're thinking of the Assyrians, perhaps they're even thinking of the Babylonians. But whoever they're thinking of right now, they are now under siege, trapped in the city of Jerusalem. Now, the city of Jerusalem is a well-fortified city, even till today. You see high walls, 30 feet high up, and it is a well-fortified city because it sits on the ridge of a mountain. And you have to go through a valley in order to go up. I don't need to be in the military to tell you that that is a very good place to hold your grounds, to defend. And enemies will have problems. But notice here that he says that the nations in plural are raging. That means it's not just one or two enemies, but many countries are gathered around there to fight against the people of God. Now, we have not gone through war in our recent memory. Many of us have not gone through a real war. But perhaps our parents or our grandparents would have gone through World War II. And we know the fear that we have. My family, for example, moved to Indonesia, to Bagan Siapi-api, during World War II. My grandma narrated when the Japanese were coming in that she had to flee by night, carrying a newborn baby, falling over again and again, and taking a boat, and after 3.5 days landing in this island off the coast of Sumatra. And there they stayed for a number of years until the war was over. They were panicking, they were fearful, they were running away. And they definitely need to move away because the enemies are coming. In a siege, you can last a long time if you have sufficient water and food. But in this case, Jerusalem doesn't have water. They probably have a little stream and it is seasonal. And so because of that, the people of God will have to run away after a period of time, perhaps months later. Now, if I were in Jerusalem, if I'm being trapped, what would I do? I would run away, right? I'll find an easiest route away and run as far away as I can, perhaps to the coast of the Mediterranean, down west, and just to run away from these enemies. But notice what the psalmist says. The psalmist says, she shall not be moved. That means she will not run away. The people of God will not run when they're under siege. How could that be? Why will they even respond with such confidence and such trust? No matter how long you can hold in a fortified city, there will come a time when you run out of water and you run out of food. And of course, there will be the constant threat of the enemies launching raids after raids against you. And so therefore, how could the psalmist say that the people of God will not be moved? And this is where we read from verses 4 and 5. It says here, there is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy habitation of the Most High. God is in the midst of her. Not only are they not to be fearful of natural calamities, not only are they not fearful of the earthquakes, the volcano eruptions, and the tsunamis, now in the midst of nations raging, they will not move. Why? Because verse 5 tells us, God is in the midst of her. As they are rebuilding this temple, they are reminded that this is the promise that God has made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is the promise that God again reminded the people of God that I will be your God and you will be my people. God lives amongst them. Does God need to live in a place made by hands in the temple? Obviously not. But God chooses to make his presence known and seen in that temple in Jerusalem, just to assure the people of God that he keeps his covenantal promises, that he is in the midst of them. Now, this is not just any other God. Again, I reminded us that this is the God who created the heavens and the earth. And this is the Lord of hosts. And we read that again in verse 7. It says, the Lord of hosts is with us. The term the Lord of hosts is the Lord of the armies. This is the warrior God. This is the God who's in the midst of them, who will fight this battle for them. They don't even need to worry. They don't need to run away. They don't need to vacate this city as refugees. Why? Because God is in the midst of them. Because why? Because this is a God who is the Lord of hosts, the Lord of the armies. And notice in verse 6 what happens when God fights for them. Verse 6 says, the nations rage, the kingdoms tottered. He utters his voice. The earth melts. He utters his voice. Everything is finished, is done. The whole earth melts. The idea of uttering his voice has echoes in the book of Genesis. In fact, in the very first few verses in Genesis chapter 1, God created the heavens and the earth with his word, with his voice. And so therefore, the people of God, as they listen to this song, as the psalmist calls them to trust in God, they are again reminded that this is the God who created the heavens and the earth with his voice, and this is the God who will fight this battle for them. Which is why they do not need to fear. Which is why they don't need to move out of this land, this city of God. And not only just that, verse 4 even paints for us a picture of serenity and of shalom, of peace. A river whose streams make glad the city of God, who makes the city happy and nourished. Why? Because this is the God who nourishes his people and his city. Why? Because God is in the midst of her. Why? Because God is the Lord of hosts. And one more thing. The psalmist reminds them that this is also the God of Jacob. This is the God of Jacob. He reminds them that this is the God of history. This is the God who keeps his covenants, his promises. This is a God who continues to live amongst them. Verse 7 says, the Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. You can make the walls of Jerusalem, and they are huge stones to defend against raiding armies, even the nations. But nothing can penetrate the fortress of God if God builds that wall, that fortress. So therefore, when the people of God are reminded that God is in the midst of them, that God is in control, that God is powerful, that God reigns, that God nourishes, that God is a promise-keeping God, how should they respond? They will not be moved because God is in the midst of them. So the first scene from verses 1 to 3 tells us of natural disasters and calamities, and the people of God are reminded not to be fearful because God is their refuge and strength, a very present help in times of trouble. And then the scene changes to a scene whereby the city of God, Zion, Jerusalem, is under siege. The nations were roaring and tottering and trying to attack them. And in the midst of all those panic and all those threats, they're reminded not to move because why? God is in the midst of them. Now the scene again changes, and the scene changes to one that is after a war. The scene changes to a scene whereby there is already a cessation of conflict. Imagine for a while the beaches of Normandy in World War II. This is a day after the D-Day, the landing of the Allied forces on June the 6th, 1944. This is the beginning of the end of the war. The beaches are filled and littered with dead bodies. The crystal blue, clean water is now in a crimson red because of the blood of the soldiers who died on the beaches. You could almost smell the rancid odor of burnt cartridges and burning flesh. You could taste the salty taste of the sea spray. This is the scene after a war. And the psalmist again paints for us a picture like that. in verses 8 to 9. Let me read for you verses 8 to 9. It says here, "Come, behold the works of the Lord, how he has brought desolations on the earth. He makes war cease to the end of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the chariots with fire." Here is a scene whereby we see the aftermath of a war. God has caused the war to cease because he has fought the war for the people of God. And the psalmist paints for us a very stark, bleak picture. A picture whereby you have bows and spears and chariots. Now those are instruments of war. Those are things that the people in the ancient world used to fight a war. Today, we have other instruments of war that are far deadlier than spears and arrows and bows and chariots. Instead of chariots, we have tanks. Instead of bows and arrows, we have M16s, we have bullets. And with a touch of a button, the entire world could be destroyed in a matter of minutes. So therefore, we live in an unprecedented time where in the hands of a few people, the world could very well cease to exist. In the midst of this aftermath of war, there will be not only just death, but also diseases. And because of those diseases, the people of God will be not only just fearful, they will not only just run away, but they will be anxious. They'll be anxious about what will tomorrow look like. How will I be able to recover property that is destroyed, but also the lives that were broken and torn apart, and the economy that is in shambles right now. Now, we are now living in a world plagued by a pandemic. And many of us are beginning to understand what even this psalmist is trying to paint for us. It's no longer just the beaches of Normandy that can be cleared up in a matter of months. Now it is global. Everywhere you have diseases, and this disease is disrupting lives and destroying lives. And so how would you respond when we know that we may not have a job waiting for us when the circuit breaker ends? Or perhaps we're entering into a recession. Or perhaps even that our reserves are depleted. And for such a small country like Singapore with no natural resources, how can we move on? And after an election that is bruising, how will the new leaders respond during this time? Those are anxious thoughts. Those are the questions that I wake up in the middle of the night and I think about. And in the midst of all these things, I will be striving. I will be nervous. I'll be anxious. Yet, we read that the psalmist says in verse 10, "Be still and know that I am God." In another translation, it says, "Cease striving and know that I am God." The question we have to ask ourselves is this: in the midst of an economic disaster, in the midst of a pandemic, in the midst of all these man-made calamities, how can you and I be still? How can you and I cease striving? How can you and I be able to sleep well at night? That is a question that you and I will have to wrestle with. Perhaps you are wrestling right now. And this is where the psalmist reminds them that they need to know that this is the God. Earlier, he paints for them two scenes. Remember, natural disasters and calamities. And then, of course, a siege. The nations were raging and they were trapped in the city of God. And now this is the aftermath of a war. He reminded them that God is a refuge and strength, a very present help in times of trouble. He reminded them that this is a promise-keeping God, the God of Jacob. He reminded them that he's in the midst of them. And yet these are just memories. recollection. But what about now? What about right now? As I'm going through all these crises, as I'm going through this whole upheaval, the psalmist says, be still and know that I am God. And he reminds them that this is the God who makes all these wars to cease to the ends of the earth. He reminded them that in verse 9 that he is the one who breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He reminds them that he burns the chariots with fire. He is the God of absolute power and sovereignty. And he reminds them that God will win someday, one day. He says, I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. That means he is going to win, even though you think that the world is in a chaos. He's going to win this war. And in the psalmist, in the people of God's idea, in their immediate context, it could very well be the threat of a foreign sovereign power. But regardless of who is going to attack Israel, God will be exalted. And again, you notice that there's a repetition in verse 11. Verse 11 is a repetition of verse 7. Exactly the same. It says here in verse 7 and 11, it says, the Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. Many of us today live in uncertain times. And we just had an election and we voted in a government that we place our confidence and our trust in. We believe that this government, regardless of whichever political party they belong to, will be able to deliver us from this disaster, this pandemic, this COVID-19 pandemic. And as Singaporean, typically I will say that, the government is doing a good job, they're good. But this psalm reminds me that my trust, my confidence should not be placed on man. It should be placed on God himself. This is the God who created the heavens and the earth. This is the God who's the Lord of hosts. This is the God who keeps his promises. This is the God who's in the midst of us. This is the God who is in control and sovereign. And that is why we will not fear. And that is why we will not be moved. And that is why we can cease striving and be still and know that he is God. The people of God, some 2,500 years ago, collected these psalms to remind them of who God is. And that they have a choice to choose between falling after man or their man-made gods, or to choose to follow after this God whom the psalmist just described to them. And yet, they face a series of challenges. They have puppet kings, they have kingdoms that are being taken away from them. They may build the huge walls and fortress around Jerusalem, but they were defeated by the Romans many years later. And so therefore, there is no absolute certainty. There's no absolute confidence in the fact that they can depend on man. And they can only but hope that one day, someday, that God himself will deliver them. For the people of God, they can only but hope for the future. But for you and I here today, we have the confidence, the assurance, and the blessed security of knowing that God is our refuge and strength, that God is our mighty fortress, that he is our God. As Martin Luther wrote this song, a mighty fortress is our God, the bulwark never failing. And he wrote this song as he meditated on Psalm 46. For you and I today, our confidence is not on the walls or on a king or an army or a political system or how much we have in our reserves. Our confidence is in a God who became flesh and dwelt with us. Our confidence is in Emmanuel, God with us. Our confidence is in Jesus Christ, God's only Son, who died for you and I, so that the sting of death would never be able to hit us again. So that even as we see the world turn upside down, as the earth shake, as the mountains move to the heart of the sea, as the waters roar and foam, we will not fear. As we see kingdoms and nations rage and totter, we will not be moved. And as we see the aftermath of a war where diseases are prevalent and pandemics is ever present, we can be still. Why? Because God is in control. God is in the midst of us. Why? God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in times of trouble. Why? Because of Emmanuel, God, Jesus with us. I pray that as we meditate on this psalm, that we are reminded of the faithfulness of God, that we are reminded that God is sovereign and in control, that we should place our trust in this unfailing God. Amen.